Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art of Prevention podcast, where we have another special guest. As always, every single guest is a special guest, and this is Sam Weichel, and he's coming all the way from Canada. So you're our first multinational guest, So we can say that the Art of Prevention podcast is now all over the world, and we're going to really dive into a specific topic that Sam has a lot of personal experience with. Both in his professional career as a sports chiropractor, as well as in his personal career as a previous Nordic or cross-country skier. And Nordic and cross-country skiers are near and dear to my heart because I treat a lot of them up here in the high country, and near and dear to the heart of the USA because we've got these awesome athletes like Jesse Diggins winning gold medals at the Olympics, and then also performing at super high levels in the circuits of Nordic skiing, winning the Tour de Ski recently. So, Sam, why don't you give us a little bit more background information about yourself, and let's get into this interview.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here. Excited to be the first international guest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So just as Nick said, I'm a sports chiropractor in Ontario. So kind of Eastern Canada, almost like Central Eastern Canada. Um, and I grew up cross country skiing. I raced cross country skiing, Nordic skiing from I think I started maybe when I was about seven-ish, and then raced all the way until I was 20. And then I kind of stopped in university, and I went to a university where there was not a lot of snow in the winter. So surprising for Canada, maybe to some people, but some places don't get a ton of snow. So the skiing wasn't amazing, and so I switched to cycling, and then I raced competitive cycling at a semi kind of professional level for 3 years, and then um, got a big boy job and realized that I wasn't super interested in that and went back to chiropractic college. And then yeah, here I am.
And which chiro school did you go to again?
I went to New York Chiropractic College, or now it's called Northeast College of Health Sciences, so upstate New York.
Cool. And now
Yeah,
you've got your own practice. Where's that practice at?
yeah. So I have my own practice now. I opened it in April 2023, so it's fairly new, but that's in Southampton, Ontario, which is like 3 hours north of Toronto.
Awesome. So to all
Yeah.
the Canadians listening in, and if you're in Toronto, then go and see Sam over at Shift Chiropractic, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yep,
Yeah, of
that's me.
course.
Yeah, that's
So
kind of my backstory.
tell me a little bit more about your experiences with cross-country skiing, because I know when we were talking before, a lot of your experiences are similar to others' experiences, where one thing that I saw clinically was a really high prevalence of low back pain amongst cross-country skiers. And then, I mean, we've really got these different categories of like limiting low back pain where people get like a low back injury and it's affecting their
Mhm.
training, it's affecting their racing, it's affecting their participation. But then this permeating and like extremely prevalent just low back pain, where I feel like a lot of these cross country skiers are extremely, extremely tough individuals. And they're like, oh, yeah, of course my back hurts. It's like, of course it hurts every day that I train. And yeah, and one of my patients was a really, really high level cross country skier in college. And she was like, oh, yeah, I mean, it's like a 5 out of 10, but I still cross country ski and do all of my training and all that stuff. And it's like, whoa, like what the heck? So could you dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So yeah, um, low back pain is pretty common in cross country skiing. It's a sport where you're doing a lot of, like, for people that don't know, like double poling or poling in general when you're either skate skiing or classic skiing. And that motion is essentially like doing a sit up every time you do it. So if you're doing like a, I don't know, 20K classic race or 15K skate race or whatever it is, you just think about how many times you're flexing your spine, which is quite interesting. I think if we went back 20 years, people would have been like, oh my God, you're flexing your spine so much. It's dangerous. But the reality is not very dangerous, but the demands are really, really high in cross country skiing. So I think the more we do it, and if we're kind of doing maybe too much too soon for that structure, we can end up in a situation where our back hurts a little bit just because we've made those tissues really sensitive. Um, when I was skiing, I didn't really have too many injuries, thankfully. I was pretty lucky, but I did kind of towards the end of my kind of high school racing career had a low back injury where I couldn't really run, was really uncomfortable to sit. I could still ski, but there were certain parts of skiing that I couldn't do or couldn't do as well without like a lot of pain. So for me, classic skiing and double poling was really uncomfortable, but I could still skate ski. So I just kind of like altered my training a little bit and managed it. But I didn't really ever formally go to get it treated because I don't know, I was maybe young and naive. That's okay.
I love all the stuff that you just talked about as far as, yeah, low back flexion, not quite the demon and evil that we thought of previously. However, it's really just a function of repetitive loading and a too much
Mm-hmm.
too soon kind of phenomenon. Same thing with things like running or really any activity. If you do too much, then you could cause an injury. And I really like that you talked about how you just modified loads in order to get yourself out of that scenario that you were in, which was that low back pain that's so prevalent. So, what are some of the training things that you did to modify your loads? Did you just change your form with skiing, or did you just change the volume and intensity, or what kind of stuff did you do?
Yeah, great question. And I think this is super important because I like to do a lot of this. I treat a lot of athletes, and athletes hate to not do their sport and are really bad at not doing their sport. And that's just the way we are.
It is.
But if we can modify activity so that you can continue to do the stuff you want, we keep that pain minimal. That's amazing. Yeah. So for me, I knew classic skiing, like classical style skiing, double poling, and then classical intensity. So sprinting type intervals really aggravated my low back. It'd be like way worse after. So I would just kind of keep my classical skiing like pretty easy, gentle, not really dip into that high intensity stuff and kind of limit the double poling I was doing. Or I would just substitute it for some skate skiing because that didn't bother me at all.
Okay.
It's skate skiing is a little less spinal flexion. There's still some, but it's a lot less than like a classical double pull.
Okay. So really like the technical
Mm-hmm.
modification and then the intensity modification in the provoking technique. And I mean, there are tons of technical proficiency. Man,
Yeah.
I would say it comes to mind as issues because for me, when I try to cross country ski, these are all of my issues because I have no technical proficiency at all. But in the different variations of uh, technical aspects of Nordic skiing, you can modify those, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what makes skiing like. If there's not a lot of literature on skiing, but if you look at literature on skiing, injury prevalence is relatively low when compared to say like running, soccer, snowboarding, any of those sports. And I think a big part of that is you can modify your technique in so many different ways. And each technique is using muscles of the body in a variety of ways. So you have this huge movement variation through skiing that you can kind of like play with if you have an injury, which is awesome.
Oh, so cross country skiers are inherent movement optimists, I guess we could say.
I like it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so I really love those different aspects of modification of activity. Okay. So what about like stabilization of the low back? Like, have you
Hmm.
utilized any techniques like that for any of your athletes or anything like that?
Yeah. So, like, you and I both know the stability of the lumbar spine is pretty important. It wants to be really stable. It enjoys that, doesn't like to have a lot of mobility. But skiing, we kind of need to have mobility through the spine, but we want to make sure we're doing that in a safe way. So making sure that the muscles of the low back are pretty strong, the core is pretty strong, and we get good at stabilizing in kind of a variety of motions because cross country skiing requires you to balance on, a skinny little ski.
No
with
edges, I
no
found
edges. Yeah, yeah, no edges.
out.
So there's a high demand for stability just in general, and if we can cross that over into making sure the low back is stable, that's really good. Now we spoke the other day. We talked a little bit about like creating intra-abdominal pressure, like we do with a lot of our DNS stuff, um, for patients with low back pain in general. And I've been thinking about that a bunch since we talked about it, because I think it's hard to apply it to skiing since the aerobic demand is so high. Breathing into your belly, using your diaphragm, you're going to do naturally in skiing, but you're also going to be using like all your other respiratory muscles because you need so much oxygen. So it's much harder to create that, stable intra-abdominal pressure thing that, when compared to like, say, you're doing a squat or something, right? So making sure that those accessory muscles for stabilization around the lumbar spine in the core are really strong, I think is important because they have to do a lot of work cross country skiing.
Oh, I totally agree. And that kind of goes on to that, the three functions of the diaphragm, the primary muscle of inspiration. One that does have that inspiratory function or the respiratory function, helping us breathe in, but then also a stability function and the sphincter function because food and stuff has to pass through and blood has to pass through that from the heart to go to the lower extremities. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really taxed when we're taxing it from both the postural function or the stability function and the respiratory function. Um,
Absolutely.
and then one thing I wanted to key into, and then I kind of spaced it, was the double-edged sword of volume with cross-country skiing. So it's a little bit of a lower impact sport, but this kind of gives some individuals just free reign to just go,
Yeah.
I look at some of the training loads, and it's kind of like swimming and cycling, where you can just train until your heart and lungs give out. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that can kind of lead to some of these overuse injuries like low back pain and shoulder pain, et cetera, correct?
Yeah, for sure. I think because like you said, it's a low impact sport, you have this ability to like recover or feel recovered quickly, even though your body's still like pretty taxed from whatever effort you did in the morning or the day before. So you can do high volume. Like some of these pro and World Cup skiers are training close to or over 1,000 hours a year, which is pretty high when you look at other sports like running or um, like yeah, track running, cross country, marathon, whatever. It's quite a bit higher, I think, and it's just because you're able to kind of absorb that load. But when you're younger or kind of getting into skiing, or you're in that high school, early university stage, is pretty. It's a high demand on the body. So yeah, you got to monitor the load, make sure you're working with your coach to like keep in mind what's going on, because it's easy to get into like a space where you're starting to tip into that overtraining, that overreaching kind of state of training, and be more susceptible to injury.
And then for coaches that might be listening to this, what are some of the signs they should be looking out for amongst their athletes that indicate, oh, there might be some overtraining happening here? We might need
Mm-hmm.
some modification of those loads because even individuals like Jessie Diggins, gold medalist at the Olympics and just won the Tour de Ski, all of that amazing stuff. She's been really upfront and open about her
Yeah.
challenges with relative energy deficiency syndrome that was brought on by disordered eating.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to touch on this too. It's something we didn't talk too much about, but previously. But I think coaches like need to monitor, athletes' mood, how their sleep is. Sometimes overtraining, you can feel really tired, but you can still have a terrible time sleeping and almost dip into like an insomnia type state where it's really hard to fall asleep. Your sleep feels terrible and you never feel rested. So monitoring that kind of stuff, that's why having like training logs where you can put comments in of like, felt great today, or, feeling tired. And you can kind of see the trends of that stuff. I think is really important, and just making sure your athletes are, being honest with you is tough sometimes because these athletes don't want to stop training. They want to progress. They're usually very driven. So sometimes it's hard to get them to be honest with you. But I think, yeah, watching for that relative energy, like, are they just kind of constantly low energy? How's their sleep? How's their mood? Are they irritable? When they're training, are they, kind of stagnating? Is their training like, not really seeing much improvement over week to week to week, month to month? Because sometimes you can keep training even though you're in this overtrained state, but you really are like not seeing improvement. You're not getting faster. You might not really be getting slower, but you're just going to kind of be stuck. And that's something to pay attention to as well.
Oh yeah, and
Um,
I need to just raise my hand because that was
yeah,
definitely me when I was in college, and I was running and running and running, doing tons of mileage, and it was that irony that you were talking about where I was exhausted, could not fall asleep. Um,
yeah,
and that's a just a sure sign of that overtraining syndrome, and it took me like months after college to sort of recover from that and normalize my HPA axis.
hmm,
It was just the weirdest thing because you're like, gosh, I just want to sleep so much. But then you get up in the morning, it's like, okay, well, I didn't fall asleep till midnight, 1 a.m., get up for 6 a.m. practice, and you're like, well, I'm just going to tough it out. I'm not going to like sleep in. I'm not a baby, and I've got teammates
yeah,
I want to show up for as well. A lot of it
for
isn't
sure.
even like that selfish thing, but it's I want to show up for my teammates today and show them that I still have that discipline, right?
Absolutely. And I think like I suffered with this as well when I was cycling, because cycling is another one of those sports where you can do a huge amount of volume.
You're
And
a glutton for punishment, aren't you, Sam?
yeah, apparently I'm learning, I'm getting better. But I think this is something I've kind of started to realize now is that I'm not, it's hard when you're competing because you feel pressure. But I think if you think about your career and your life long term, you're like, okay, I want to be healthy. I want to keep training. I want to just keep getting fitter. You can't look at just that season. You have to look at like the next season and the next season and even the season after that of like, where do I want to be? And then, so I think from a coaching standpoint, it's really helpful to educate your athletes on like, we need to look at this from a broad standpoint rather than results we want this season. Season results are important. You want to look at those too, but have goals for down the line, kind of educate on if we get into this overtrained state, it can take sometimes years to get out of it, or at least a year before your body recovers and things kind of balance out. So education is, I think, is huge.
Yeah, and there are many different components to that quote unquote getting out of it, digging yourself out of the hole, if you will. There's the physiological component, but then
Mm-hmm.
the lingering mental components as well. And sometimes those are the
Absolutely.
most difficult to get rid of, where you have to work with someone like a nutritionist or a sports psychologist. I had a sports psychologist named Lucy Haynes on the podcast a couple of months ago, and that was pretty much all we talked about for the entire episode was, yeah, it's really tough to get out of that hole once you're in there. And sometimes you
Mm-hmm.
think that you're out of it and then bam, it comes right back for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad we kind of are touching on this because I think nutrition in cross country skiing is super important. And I think it's a big way that we can limit injury or decrease injury risk because I cross country skiers are, I think, not great at fueling as a whole. More like I don't think many athletes are great at fueling. Like it's kind of falls by the wayside. But I think cross country skiing is especially bad because the demand of the sport is so high, like aerobically, physiologically, like you're using so many muscles of the body and you can do big hours, but then the fueling during and after is super, super important. And I think just from personal experience, talking to friends that are still racing at a high level, like the fueling is super key and it's kind of underutilized um, as a recovery tool. Like fueling during training is, if you're going out for a 3 hour ski or 3 hour roller ski in the summer and you're having like two Nature Valley bars on your on your 3 hour ski, like that's not doing it right. And we know that with science and especially with all that's going on in the endurance world with like new technology in fueling. It's changing. Like we're seeing marathon records like drop like crazy. Triathlon is, insanely fast now. And I think a big component of that is athletes are able to fuel at such a higher rate than they were in the past. And I think skiing is behind because it's a bit more niche, but it's catching up. But I think fueling for athletes in this sport is super important if we want to prevent injury and then improve performance for sure.
Oh, yeah. And I think it goes to those just sheer demands of the sport. 3 hours of relatively high intensity training and
Mm-hmm.
continuous training too. Like for me, I used to be, more of a runner, but now I'm more of a rock climber. And with rock climbing, it's like, okay, I do a pitch and then I come down to the ground and I hang out for 30 minutes,
Yeah.
And so I can eat
Yeah,
a snack or I
exactly.
can do whatever. And my energy demands really aren't even that incredibly high. Whereas with cross country skiing, it's like 3 hours of a continuous skate ski or a continuous, whatever technical aspect you're working on ski. It's difficult to fuel during that time because you either have to carry it, or you have to have a coach that's going to carry it for you.
Mm-hmm.
You have to
And then you
ingest.
got poles on, which is it's like hard to grab stuff. So I think it's from that standpoint too. It's like it just complicates the fueling. So they're like, yeah, whatever, I'll just eat after.
Yeah. Do you have any
Yeah.
tips or tricks for any athletes that are trying to more appropriately fuel during their efforts?
Yeah. I would say like there's a couple options. Like obviously you can eat a solid bar food. Just make sure you're getting carbs in during your training. Like that's kind of the most important thing is aim for. I mean, I'm not a nutritionist or a dietitian, but aim to get carbs in while you're training. An easy way to do this as a skier, because most of us carry like a water belt or something, is a carbohydrate drink. So like Morton drink mix, precision nutrition, like those are all kind of newer onto the scene. Scratch Labs out of Colorado, little
Yeah.
shout out. Like they all have carbohydrate drinks that are, you're getting maybe 30 grams of carbs or 40 grams of carbs um, in a serving. So you can kind of up that for your train depending on your training. Um, but that's an easy way because then you're just drinking it. You don't have to worry about wrappers or eating a bar or something like that, and you can just drink the mix.
And I know some people have started to almost demonize like sugar and carbohydrate intake and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really big shift towards, high fat diets and low carbohydrate diets and decreasing the need for carbohydrates. But we really have to think about this special population, or if you're a Nordic skier or a cross country skier, you are part of a special population that definitely needs carbohydrate at a very high level. And that is sports drinks that contain sugars and things like that to fuel you during your runs. Like I know there was this video of some like influencer person, I won't mention their name or anything like that, but they're saying that like oatmeal is not the breakfast of champions. And then
Yeah,
somebody had a cut to Eliud Kipchoge, and they're
I
like,
think I saw
Eliud,
this.
what did you eat the morning of, going sub 2 hours in the marathon, or the last time you won a major marathon? And he goes, oh, oatmeal.
Yeah,
And it's like,
yeah,
this is a special population. You need carbohydrates and you need a lot of them.
100%. Yeah, and I think we're learning more and more about how proper fueling really limits or decreases injury risk and prevalence in athletes for sure. So I think that's a huge component.
There's a reason it's called relative energy deficiency syndrome, and that energy is in
Mm-hmm.
of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Kind of
Yeah,
almost in that order, really.
yeah, absolutely,
Sweet.
absolutely.
Um, and we talked about, this being a double-edged sword, kind of like swimming and leading to a lot of these overuse injuries, not only to the low back, but also to the shoulder. And that's something that I
Mm-hmm.
saw quite a bit with my clinical population was a decent amount of shoulder injury just from the consistent and repetitive double poling, the skate skiing, like uphill skate skiing, etc.
Yeah,
Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the shoulder injuries that you've seen both personally and professionally, and some of the factors that
yeah,
lead to that?
yeah. So Personally, I haven't seen a ton, and I mean, obviously you've seen a lot, but I haven't seen as many. But I think, as you mentioned, like it's a pretty dynamic movement with the shoulder, and we're using the shoulder in a lot of different ways. So skiing uphill is a great example because you guys call it something different in the States, I think, but we call it offset, where one pole is high and the other pole, like you can't really see me, other pole is a little bit lower, and that's for going uphill. And you can change sides when you're doing this, but often, especially with adolescent skiers and younger skiers, it's you're building that technical efficiency as you grow, going from offsetting on there I am one side to offsetting on the other side is really challenging to do. It's kind of like writing with your left hand if you're right-handed, or vice versa. But that means like if you're doing a 10K race or a 15K race or even a 20K race, like you're going to be going up every hill with one shoulder doing a higher, like more dynamic, more powerful motion than the other one. And so we can just think about that similar to the low back. If we're doing that all season, every time we go up a hill in training and racing and everything, that's just so much more load on one side versus the other. And so it's just like anything, you load it enough, it's going to not have the capacity to manage that, and we have to slow down for a bit. So if we can learn how to like seamlessly switch sides from one to the other and offset, or like as we're going up a hill, if we're going to the right, we're offsetting on one side, and then going to the left, we're offsetting on the other side. We're just having more movement variation, that movement optimism. We're making everything kind of work well together rather than just putting all the stress on one structure.
It seems like a big factor in that technical proficiency is symmetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I talked to one of my friends that's still, this is about the symmetry stuff, he's racing still. And he was like, through the summer, we roller ski, right? For training. So we got little skis with wheels on them. Sometimes great, sometimes terrifying because they have no brakes.
I've seen them and
But
they look absolutely terrifying. I mean, they look,
yeah,
I mean, you say little skis, but if you compare this to like a pair of skates, they're like four
yeah,
times the length of skates.
sure. Yeah,
And with no brakes. So stopping is difficult. You don't
yeah,
have as much mobility as a set of regular skates, and you're going at really high speeds on concrete.
yeah. Pavement is the other factor there. But anyway, so we were talking about that because like road has camber, so the water runs off of it,
Oh, I've never
and
thought
ski
about
trails
that.
don't. Yes, it's interesting. Like runners maybe sometimes get this as well. Like if you're a marathoner, if you'll always run on the same side of the road for your long runs, one hip is going to be hiked up way higher than the other one. And if you're doing that for 20,000, 30,000 steps, it's just a lot more stress on that joint. And eventually that's kind of going to make it sensitive and it's not going to like that. So similar with skiing, if you're always, doing your roller skis on the same route or always on the same side of the road in the same area through the whole summer, one hip's going to be like slightly higher than the other. And every single stride you take, every pull you do, you're kind of working with this slight asymmetry. And that's not inherently bad, but if you're doing, you know, 200 hours of training over the summer, or 20 hours a week or something like that, it starts to add up and can make things, a little sensitive and unhappy, and lead to just some pain and discomfort while you're doing that. So it's important to be able to add some variety to that motion.
And I know a lot of Nordic skiers will actually cross train as well in the summers, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah. So we'll do like spend some time in the gym, obviously, because there's a lot of strength involved in the sport, but lots of skiers will run, mountain bike, road cycle, stuff like that, just to complement their training and get more aerobic stuff in. It's not necessarily as taxing. Running is definitely something that skiers do a lot of in the summer, which kind of presents its own host of
I
other
was
things, obviously, right?
Yeah, that's something that I've noticed a little bit as well is you take this huge, massive engine that's been working in a low impact, super high volume activity like cross country skiing, and then you take that engine and then you put it on in running shoes, and
Yeah,
you've now got this great engine and a vehicle that's not used to the types of loads associated with running. And I've
100%.
seen a couple of issues like crop up, and it's like sometimes with these athletes, they come to see me and it's like, yeah, the season's about to start and I've got this shin pain, and I'm thinking like bone stress, like injury or like stress reaction going on in the back of my mind. And I'm like, look, running is not the goal. The goal is when the snow falls that you're on that and performing at a very high level. Do you have any
Hmm.
advice for people or some things that you've found to be really good for you when you transition from snow to pavement with either
Yeah,
skating or with running?
yeah. So I think you said it perfectly with like, I see this all the time too. People with massive engines getting into running, and I did this too after cycling. It's like you have the ability to run really fast and for a long time, but your body is like the structures of your body are so not used to that motion and that stress. And so it's really important to just like slowly build into it. And so even though, say, you feel great running at like a, I don't know, in miles, but like a 5:30 per kilometer, which is probably like an 8-minute mile or something like that. And it feels awesome. You probably should be running at like a 6-minute per K, which is more like a 10-minute mile. And even though it feels really slow, you're still getting great aerobic benefit, but you're putting way less stress on your body. And so that's the important thing is we want to just limit the amount of stress when we're first starting out, ease into that running and that off-season training, because pavement obviously feels very different from snow, and you can actually kind of going back to shoulder and arm injuries, like polling on pavement, very different from snow. So you can see like
Oh, I didn't even
maybe
thought
some
about
elbow
that yet.
injuries, like a tendonitis, tennis elbow, golfer's elbow type injury from just the impact of pulling into pavement versus softer surface of snow. So easing into those things, keeping intensity relatively light at the start. And I think most coaches are pretty good about this of like, let's just play around with some movement at the start of the summer season and get into stuff slowly before we start to build into our intensity.
Wait, so you're saying we should have fun when we're training? Oh, that's
Yeah,
that's totally against no, I
it's why we
totally,
all start. So
yeah.
let's make sure to keep it fun.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I had the same thing happen to me. You know, uh, I was training for, doing a little bit of running up here. I live at 9,000 feet of elevation. And then I went home to Texas, which is like sea level or maybe less than sea level where I live, just north of Houston. And I was doing just a little bit of running, and I was running at like 10-minute pace per mile, which really, like, if I look at it from the lens of previous like cross country runner Nick, is like not even running. So then
Yeah.
I go home to Texas and I go for a run with my brother, and I've got tons of red blood cells and a really nice like hematocrit from just living at this high elevation. And then I go home and I'm running like literally 3 minutes faster per mile. And then, you know, cardiovascularly, I'm feeling pretty good, which I feel like a lot of Nordic skiers experience when they go out on the running trails. Oh, I feel if this feels
Mm-hmm.
quite easy for me cardiovascularly, I can push it a little bit more. And then I got so sore I could barely walk for like a week after that. So
Yeah.
we've got to think about, yeah, you've got this great engine, your heart and lungs and blood vessels and vasculature are amazingly ready to go, but there are different impact loads associated with these different activities too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then the one kind of curveball condition that I threw at you right before we started this that kind of put the fear of God into some of the local coaches' eyes here in the high country was exertional compartment syndrome. So, yeah, I know that we're not really experts on exertional compartment syndrome, although it really seems like no one is an expert on how to treat this effectively.
Yeah.
We know that for an acute compartment syndrome etiology, so coaches, if you're listening to this is that really numb foot presentation that some athletes will get where they're like, oh, I feel like I can't push off and I can't feel my foot. And it's not because of cold weather or anything like that. I just can't feel my foot. This is called a compartment syndrome, where you're getting increased pressure in some of the compartments of the lower extremity, like the shin and the ankle. And this increased pressure can put pressure on some of the neurovascular structures, so the blood vessels and the nerves, leading to that numbness. And if gone on too long, this can lead to pretty serious injury over time. And we've got two variations. We've got the acute compartment syndrome, which this is like an emergency setting where even if you stop your activity, that numbness does not go away. And then a lot of times they'll have to perform this pretty gruesome fasciotomy where they take a scalpel and basically stick it in the top of your shin and then run it all the way down in order to relieve that pressure. And then some of the treatments for an exertional compartment syndrome are basically just minor versions of that, where they poke holes in the fascia to relieve some of that pressure when people are exercising. So Sam, I know we talked in brief about this beforehand, and you've seen or heard of some athletes getting this. I haven't seen this myself in clinic, but as always, we want to reduce the risk of this. So, what are some of your ideas as far as risk reduction for exertional compartment syndrome?
Yeah, that's a great question. um, and it's one of those things that's tricky because it usually comes on right when the athlete is doing their sport. And as we talked about earlier, like that's hard to stop someone from doing. And I think like from what I've seen and what we've maybe looked at, like exertional compartment syndrome, maybe a lot of the time is not actually a compartment syndrome. And they don't know what it is, but it presents that way. And so you do the fasciotomy, you do whatever. And I know we both know how important fascia is. It's not something you really want to get rid of,
Yeah.
but you do if you have to. But I would say it kind of goes back to minimizing load, minimizing stress. So actually, interestingly enough, last winter, I was dealing with very, very similar symptoms to exertional compartment syndrome when I was running. And it was very strange. The only thing that I could pinpoint to it being was an exertional compartment syndrome. So like basically I would start running and I'd been running all year, no problems. And then eventually like towards the fall, I started running or I continued running and I would get like really intense calf shin pain and the muscles would just feel so fatigued. And like I just have to stop and walk. And I was like, this would happen after 2 or 3K of running. So like a mile and a half or something. So not a lot.
Yeah.
And I'd been running all summer. So I was like, this doesn't really make sense. But then I went away on a ski trip and I cross country skied for 8 days, had no issues at all. So I think interestingly, and then I would come home and I'd start running again and the same symptoms came back. It was exactly the same. So long story short, I think modifying activity to limit symptom presentation. So I think skiing is probably relatively good for this because of how no one muscle is like stressed more than others. Like running is obviously like we're really stressing the gastroc and the soleus and Achilles tendon, right? Like we see those injuries all the time.
Oh yeah.
Versus skiing, like you're working those muscles, but everything else is working almost in an equal amount. And I don't have EMG studies to show that this is true, but I think as a skier, you can kind of feel like that no one muscle is like overly taxed in skiing to the extent that it is in running or even cycling. Like cycling is obviously predominantly and almost exclusively your legs. So I think that makes skiing like a nice switch. Now, technically wise, classical skiing over skate skiing might be more challenging for a compartment type syndrome because it mimics running a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But I think limiting load and finding activities that the athlete can do that don't aggravate symptoms. I think most athletes, if it is a compartment or an exertional compartment syndrome and it's relatively mild, should be able to continue their sport with a few modifications, taking a bit more rest, maybe dialing back some intensity in certain techniques, and feeling it out. I think they should be able to continue in a way that's safe and they still can be competitive.
So
I
it seems
think
like,
that answered the question.
oh my gosh, yeah. So it seems like coaches, it would behoove them to be curious, really. How long was it
Mm-hmm.
until you started to feel your symptoms? What technique were you doing when you started to feel your symptoms? Can we modify the volume that you're doing? Can we modify the intensity? And then can we modify the technique? And if we can't modify those to decrease symptom presentation, then let's go to some cross training. Let's put you on the bike. Let's have you go for a swim or something like that, as opposed
Yeah.
to beating our head against the wall with this really tricky issue of exertional compartment syndrome. So yeah, I think,
And I think
oh, go ahead.
sorry. I think sometimes too, it's like if we talk about the volume of skiing, like we're doing a lot, and sometimes it just takes a bit of a step back and a step away from skiing, trying cycling, trying swimming, continue to be active, but giving those muscles a little bit of rest, so to speak, from such a high demand sport. And so you can continue to train, but just try like some cycling or some swimming, something that's going to relax them a little bit or just work them in a slightly different way. And then you can come back to the skiing and you could have a complete kind of resolution of symptoms.
Yeah, and I know when I was a runner, it was like, gosh, I can't miss a day of training, and I got to run
Mm-hmm.
through this little like nagging thing because I got to do well for my teammates, etc. But we also have to recognize that like physiologically, you don't lose all of your fitness by taking a couple of days off, right?
No, no. And mentally, it's very hard, but if you can do it, it's probably going to benefit you in the long run.
Yeah, I mean that's a lot, one thing that a lot of like, maybe some traditional medical providers don't get is like mentally, it is so difficult to get out of training mode. It's like
Yeah.
when your life revolves around running 100 miles a week, like you wake up and you go for a run as your first thing in the morning, and then all you're doing is resting and preparing for your second run that's later that day. So
Yeah.
if you take those away, or even if you modify those to something like cycling or something like that, one, you're being ostracized from your social group and
Mm-hmm.
you're getting taken out of that routine, which can be really difficult. But something that you mentioned earlier that I think is really important was taking a step back, getting a bird's eye view of your training and your overall goals, not only the goals for that day, that training week, but really like what are our month-long goals? What are our season-long goals? What are our multi-year goals?
Mm-hmm.
Because if you get something like an exertional compartment syndrome and you really piss it off, like we said, once it's really, really bad, it's really tough to treat.
Yeah.
So we can nip it in the bud. That's the best way to go. And sorry, I kind of went down a tangent rabbit hole there.
No, that's great.
What were you gonna
Yeah.
say there?
Well, just like, yeah, I echoing what you said, like nip it in the bud rather than try and treat it. Cause yeah, once you're treating it, it's really hard to manage. There's some like acupuncture or dry needling can be helpful for sure. And I've seen that work and I've seen some little bit of literature on it, but it's not 100% fix all the time. It sometimes it does take that like step back. What's my what are my goals? What does this look like from a career standpoint, and go from there.
Yeah, so it sounds like, athletes, coaches need to be really proactive with this as well as other, manifestations of injury or injury type things, and then have really good providers in their back pocket that can hopefully help them with one, the diagnosis and say, hey, I think this might be some exertional compartment syndrome. I do believe that it is time to take a little bit of a rest and we'll work on some of those soft tissues, work on some of that fascia to help it relax a little bit while you're also resting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And then, so as far as like for clinicians, in treating this issue, you said some dry needling and acupuncture.
Yeah, I think dry needling and acupuncture can be helpful just because we get that increase in blood flow, some calming of the nervous system, promotion of tissue healing, and I think just aiding in maybe some of that acute swelling of tissue. Um, I don't know like the entire mechanism. I'm not sure that anyone actually does because acupuncture is one of those ones that's like we don't really get this, but it works really well.
Yeah. And I think there's more and more literature coming out regarding
Hmm.
acupuncture and its effects. I know mechanistically, you're also going to have an effect on those mechanoreceptors.
Yeah,
So if we're
exactly.
having too much tension and tightness and we want to have an effect on mechanoreceptors, yeah, we can stick our thumb in it a lot and that's going to have an effect. We can stretch it, that's going to have an effect, but nothing's really going to penetrate those tissues like a needle. You know what I mean?
No, and we can get exactly where we want to be and just poke a bunch of needles in it.
Yeah,
And
and
it
really
is,
low risk, you know?
yeah,
Like
very low risk.
there's no reason to not try something like acupuncture or dry needling because if you let exertional compartment syndrome go too long, the thing that's going to be poking into that tissue is the scalpel, you know?
Hmm.
And once you
Yeah,
do that,
exactly.
there's no going back, you
Yeah.
know?
No, no, exactly. And I think that can, you can fix the compartment syndrome, but then you often are left with a bunch of other issues.
Oh yeah, I mean, I got an ankle surgery myself when I was a runner, and I had an awesome, just incredible surgeon. Surgery went really well, but in spite of all those awesome things that I had going for me, that ankle is just not the same.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we want to be really proactive with conservative measures, and seeing a really good sports chiropractor who's, either had previous experience in the sport like yourself or someone who knows and utilizes a lot of different techniques like soft
Hmm.
tissue techniques. And, unfortunately, we can't really do great manipulations of the lower extremity. They're okay, but like nothing's going to really manipulate like the gastroc soleus group or the anterior tibialis.
Yeah.
An argument could maybe be made for like an H reflex phenomenon that's going to occur to relax the muscles. But when you're looking out for a provider, if you're a coach or an athlete, like look for someone, if they're going to treat your athletes, make sure that they've got a lot of continuing education and a lot of tools in their tool belt for treating athletes.
Hmm. And that was for me, like it's one of the reasons I wanted to become a chiropractor because like when I was an athlete, if I did see a provider, often they didn't understand the sport or even just the demands of that sport. Like endurance sports are very different from like hockey, football, right?
Yeah.
Like those sports have high demand, but if you're seeing a practitioner and their background is like they played D1 hockey or something, that's great, and they're probably going to have a lot of good information. But endurance sport, the demand is really different, and often the mindset of the athletes is different. Like it's important to find someone who understands what you're going through, what you're working on, and why injuries like this start to happen.
Yeah. So with that, I mean, it goes back to some of our treatment modalities. I can't tell you how many nights I spent icing my Achilles, only to find out when I was in school and learning some of the literature that ice is not going to do anything for a tendon injury.
Yeah.
Um, and so that just goes back to finding those good providers with experience and knowledge that is specific to that sport. All right, Sam.
Yeah,
Well,
one
man,
hundred
we've
percent.
we've talked about a lot of different things today. Um,
Yeah.
going from low back flexion and how it's not really like the demon that we once thought it was 20 years ago, but maybe more associated with too much too soon, too much volume or intensity, and how we can mitigate or change that volume or intensity. We talked about modifying activities and how actually Nordic skiing and cross country skiing is a great exercise. Really, we didn't even talk about the longevity aspects of it, but
Yeah.
some of the healthiest individuals in the world partially due to the amazing VO2 maxes, is associated with the amount of aerobic training that you can get with cross-country skiing. We talked about energy deficiency syndrome and fueling. We talked about the shoulder. We talked about cross training for cross-country skiing. And then we had a really nice primer on exertional compartment syndrome.
Yeah, we
I
covered a
know,
bunch.
yeah, I know back when I was in exercise physiology courses, I was a runner, so running's the best, running's so awesome, but when it came to factors like VO2 max, it was always the cross-country skiers that were number one. Like,
Yeah, and insane numbers, like in the 80s, even I think like low 90s for some of the like famous ones in literature, and yeah,
yeah,
which is just bonkers.
yeah. So Sam, at the end of every episode, I always go on this really nerdy tangent about Benjamin
I
Franklin
love it.
and how when he founded the volunteer fire department in Philadelphia, he said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that's kind of the whole point of this podcast, if you will, to reduce the risk of preventable injuries and uh,
Hmm.
do things that we can to proactively prevent these types of injuries from occurring. And I know that we've talked about a lot of different things that we can do to reduce the risk of injury, but if we had to sum it up into just a little ounce of prevention, what would you say to either athletes or coaches or other providers to help cross-country skiers prevent injury?
Oh, that is tough because yeah, there's so much of what we talked about today. I feel like we could have a whole podcast on spinal flexion in cross country skiing. Like there,
Ooh,
we
I
can get
like
into
it.
a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think I think for me, like my perspective, biggest thing we can do in skiing is monitor load management and make sure you're fueling properly. Because I think those are areas that typically get kind of neglected because, as we discussed, you can do a ton of load as a cross country skier and a huge amount of volume. But we also know that it's a hard sport to fuel in. Like I remember racing, and I'm sure this has kind of changed, but like racing 50Ks, which is, it's like 2.5 hours of racing
That's a long
or a
time.
little bit more. It's a long time, but like you're, you're having like half a cup of Gatorade like 3 times in that event. When you look at marathon runners now, they're taking like 17 gels over a marathon. The fueling difference between those two things is huge. And I think cross country skiing is catching up to that. But if we can kind of nail the fueling aspect of skiing, both during activity and after, and work with monitor our load management, I think you're gonna be pretty sweet with it.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to sum up and really just reiterates the points that many guests have made on this podcast. Like we have to fuel appropriately. We have to monitor our training loads and not lose the forest of the trees with our day-to-day activities and loads.
Absolutely.
So, Sam, where can people find you? I know that you've got an Instagram page for your office and for any cross-country skiers that maybe want to pick your brain, where should they
Yeah.
contact you at?
Yeah, Instagram is great. I hate to say it, but like I talk to a lot of people on Instagram, and it feels like really informal. But I'm a pretty chill guy, and if that's the easiest place for people to get to me, then that's fantastic. So yeah, my Instagram is just Shift Chiropractic, but that's also the name of my practice. So like you can Google me, all my contact information's on my website. Um, Dr. Sam at shiftchiropractic.ca is my email. So if you have questions and want to email or send me an Instagram, feel free. I'd love to chat.
Awesome, Sam. Well, I think I'll put you on the docket for an entire hour-long episode on low back flexion in the future. And hopefully I can
Nice.
get you out to Colorado and we can get on some skis, hopefully some with edges, huh?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love skis with edges too. I'm not partial only to cross country skiing, so we can do that for sure. That'd be awesome.
That's perfect because I'm the partial one in this scenario. My one experience with the Nordic skiing was a lot of being on the ground. You know what I mean?
It happens. It's where we all start for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to another interview in the future. And thanks so much for your time today, Sam.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was awesome. It was great. I'm glad we could connect and chat. It was super fun.
Awesome. I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Art of Prevention podcast. If you did enjoy this episode and maybe got some great information out of it, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you found this podcast. One thing to note is that this podcast is for educational purposes only, and if you are dealing with an injury or significant pain or discomfort, etc., please consult with a medical professional before engaging in any of the activities or movements, etc., discussed on this podcast. Be on the lookout next week for another new episode of the Art of Prevention podcast, where we try to reduce your risk of your next injury.